introduce our speaker. Her name is Zoe Weil, and she is the co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education. Tonight she will be speaking about the interconnectedness of all life, animal welfare, environmental preservation, and human rights. Quoting from Ms. Weil, her humane education not only instills the desire and capacity to live with compassion, integrity, and wisdom, but also provides the knowledge and tools to put our values into action in meaningful, far-reaching ways. It enables us to find solutions that work for all by approaching human rights and environmental preservation and animal protection as interconnected and integral dimensions of a healthy and just society. Weil has served as a consultant on humane education to people and organizations around the world. In 2012, she debuted her one-woman show, The Ongoing Problem with Kindness, Confessions of a Mogo Girl. I'm not sure what Mogo is, but I'm sure she'll explain it. Which explains humane education through humor and stories about Weil's life as she tries and periodically fails to always be kind. Which I also find hard to believe that she's not always kind. In 2010, Weil was inducted into the Animal Rights Hall of Fame, and in 2012 she received an award from the Women in Environmental Leadership Program at Yunus College. Received a Master's in Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School and a Master's in English Literature from the University of Pennsylvania. She is certified in psychosynthesis counseling, a form of psychotherapy which relies upon the intrinsic power of each person's imagination to promote growth, creativity, health, and transformation. Won't you join me in welcoming Zoe Weil to Quinnipiac, and we all look forward to what you have to say.
Welcome, everybody. And I have to tell you, this is such an honor to be invited here by the Albert Schweitzer Institute. Albert Schweitzer has been one of my heroes, and so to be invited to speak here is, well, it feels a little daunting, like I have to walk in his footsteps, but I'll do my... Isn't my mic on? I thought my mic was on, my lavalier. Oh, it's only for there. Okay. You can edit that part out of the final video. So I'm a humane educator. And a humane educator is somebody who teaches about the interconnected issues of human rights and animal protection and environmental preservation in order to give learners of all ages and in age-appropriate ways the knowledge and the tools and the motivation to contribute to a better world for all people, all species, and for the Earth itself. So that's what I've been doing for the past 25 years of my life. And when I first started doing this work, I was living in Philadelphia, and I offered free programs to students all around the Philadelphia area. And I would go into schools, and I was often invited to give presentations at assembly programs. And this was before PowerPoint, and so I'd get up there and I'd sort of feel like I had to do something a little bit different from standing behind a podium and speaking into a microphone. So I brought in this bag of props, and in the bag were objects that represented choices. So I might have a ceramic mug and a styrofoam cup, and I might have a rag and some paper towels, and I might have a cloth diaper and disposable diaper. And I would take these items out and I would ask, which of these two items does the most good and the least harm? To yourself, to other people, to animals and the environment. Well, after years of asking this question, I realized that doing the most good and the least harm had become the guiding principle of my life. And I call it the Mogo Principle, Mogo being short for most good. So that explains it for you, David. That's where Mogo Girl comes from, which is another story which maybe I'll get to later. Now, why is it so important that we strive to do the most good and the least harm? I mean, that might seem like a sort of obvious question, but I think that it's beyond our personal sense that that would be a good thing to do. Because in today's world, we are facing potentially catastrophic problems between global warming and the potential loss of half of all species on Earth by the end of this century, and a growing population of over 7 billion people, each of whom needs access to clean water and adequate food and a home and a job at a time when we face dwindling resources, and 1 billion of whom don't currently even have access to adequate food or clean water. Things can look pretty grim. And that's not even mentioning all of the other animals who we brutalize every year around the globe to satisfy our desires. I was looking up a bunch of Schweitzer quotes to share with you tonight, and here's my first one. Albert Schweitzer said, "Compassion in which all ethics must take root can only attain its full breadth and depth if it embraces all living creatures. But at this particular point in history, we brutalize and kill around 1 trillion, with a T, animals every single year. And that's not including insects, okay? That's 1 trillion mostly vertebrate animals. Now, when people hear that number, they think that can't possibly be true. You know, I mean, we only kill, 10 billion animals in the United States every year, land animals, so how can that be true? Well, it's true because most of those animals are in our oceans. We're just simply destroying our oceans, just taking nets and killing so many. And fishery after fishery after fishery is declining. So the reason why it's so important that we each try to do the most good and the least harm is not only because it's good for us, it's good for our souls, it's good for our friends and neighbors and fellow citizens, but also because it's at this point in history essential that we do this if we are going to solve these grave crises that we face. Now, this idea of doing the most good and the least harm, let me just see a show of hands. Is there anybody in this room who thinks that trying to do the most good and the least harm is not a good principle by which to live, is not a good principle? Anyone? Okay, so nobody has ever said that they don't think it's a good principle by which to live. How many of you think it's actually a good principle by which to live? Okay, lots and lots of hands going up. Good. So something this simple, why do you need to talk about it? Why did I write a whole book about it? Because it's really, really hard to put this principle into practice in our complex and globalized world. Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to do the most good and the least harm? Well, there are 4 primary reasons why it's so hard. The first one is that we lack information about the effects of our choices. Most of us know what it means to be kind to our friends, to our families, to our neighbors. We know what that looks like. But what does it mean to be kind if the foods you eat and the clothes you wear and the products you buy and the electronics you use cause destruction and suffering and cruelty and death to people and animals all around the globe? What does it mean to be kind then? We simply lack information about the effects of our choices. And it used to be that you pretty much knew where your clothes came from, where your food came from, where your energy sources and building materials came from. It wasn't until 100 or 200 years ago that we stopped knowing. But just look down at yourself. Look at your clothes. Do you have any idea where they came from? And I don't mean the store you bought them at, but where they were manufactured. Well, you know, if I asked you to turn to each other and look at the tag behind you, you could find out a piece of where they come from, at least where they were assembled, but would you know where the fabric came from? How it was produced? We don't know this stuff. So without the information, it's very difficult to make choices that do the most good and the least harm. Which brings me to the second challenge, which is that a lot of us don't want to know the information. Now, why don't we want to know the information? Well, it's hard to get, so it makes it inconvenient for us to do that kind of research. But what happens when we know? Well, then we're faced with a potential quandary. So many, many years ago, I was on a bus trip with a friend of mine, and the bus pulled into a rest stop, and my friend got out, and she stopped at McDonald's, and she got some food back, and she put it down on the seat between us, and she looked at me, and she said, "Zoe, don't tell me. I don't want to know." I think what she was really saying to me is, if you tell me about the effects of this food choice, then I'm going to be faced with the reality that I may be letting my desires eclipse my values. And that doesn't feel very good. It doesn't feel good to live without integrity. And when we let our desires eclipse our values, then we're living without integrity. Integrity just means we're walking our talk. We're living according to our values. So the second challenge is that many of us don't really want to know about the effects of our choices. So what's the third challenge? The third challenge is that there are so many systems in place that even if we are willing to know, if we are willing to do what Albert Schweitzer said when he said, "Think occasionally of the suffering of which you spare yourself the sight." If you are willing to know, what do you do with the reality that sometimes you can't make a choice that does the most good and the least harm? So for example, how many people in this room have a cell phone? How many people have a computer? How many people have a car? How many people have all three? Okay, that was a lot of us. So in our cell phones, in our computers, in all of our electronics, including the electronics in our cars, there are all sorts of components that are mind and toxic in ways that are inhumane, that are filled with toxins. And we can't just buy a different computer that's less toxic or that's more humane. How many of you have heard of the ore coltan? Okay, a few of you in the room have heard of this. Coltan is mined around the world, but one of the places where it's mined is in the Congo. And the mining of coltan is contributing to a civil war, and to genocide, and to child soldiers, and slavery. Now, is there anybody in this room who is in support of child soldiers and slavery? Of course not. But coltan is in our electronics, and some of that coltan probably comes from the Congo. I'm guessing that nobody really wants to see the extinction of gorillas, but the mining of coltan is contributing to that too. So we are all embedded in systems from which we cannot easily extricate ourselves simply by buying a different product. Now, sometimes we can, but sometimes we can't. And so sometimes what happens is that when people really embrace this idea of learning about the effects of their choices and come up against the fact that they are making inhumane and unsustainable and unjust choices every day, they give up. And they decide that their choices don't matter and it's not worth it. But here's the good news. Your choices do matter, and they are worth it, and things are changing. How many of you have read or heard about Steven Pinker's book that came out last year called The Better Angels of Our Nature? Few people are raising your hand. I highly recommend this book. It's quite a lot to get through. It's about 600 pages, although a lot of those pages are citations. And this book painstakingly explores the historical record to give evidence for the fact that we are actually living in less violent, less discriminatory, and less cruel times than ever before in recorded history. Now that can be really hard to believe, and I'm seeing some people in the audience whose faces are frowning right now, because it's hard to believe, so I just really recommend that you read this book. Because for me, reading this book was a reminder that what Martin Luther King Jr. said about how the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice is true. You know, just think about it. 100 years ago, half the people in this room couldn't vote. Think about the changes that have happened in so many ways. You know, we used to have public executions, and everybody in the village would come out and watch people being hanged. This happened all over Europe. That doesn't happen today in Europe. Things are changing. And so that is the good news. Our choices do matter. What we do does matter, and we are creating changes. So how can we actually try and put this principle into practice? Well, when I wrote my book, I was thinking about all of the ways that I try and put this principle into practice and what has helped me. And I came up with 7 keys to leading a Mogo life. And when I say 7 keys, it sort of sounds like 5 habits or 10 steps, and it's not like that. These aren't immutable keys. You don't do them in any order. They've just been ways that have helped me to put this principle into practice that I want to share with you. So the first one, the first key, is to live your epitaph. Now, what do I mean by living your epitaph? Well, all of us are going to die one day, and somebody will probably write an obituary for us, and somebody may do a eulogy, and on our gravestone may be an epitaph, a very short, succinct way of summing up our life. And somebody else is likely to write it. You're not going to write it because you'll be dead, right? I mean, I guess there are some people who plan ahead, and they write their own epitaph, or they write their own obituary, or maybe even their eulogy. But most of us don't write it. But what if we did? What if you went home tonight and you actually wrote your epitaph? You wrote down what you want said to sum up your life when you die. What if you did that? What that would open a door toward is actually being able to live your epitaph, because you would have put down on paper what you want your life to be about. Now, a lot of people in this room are in college, and I would hate to think that you would write your epitaph tonight and then put it away for the rest of your life. You might have a different epitaph in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years. It can be something that we do all the time. Well, maybe not every night, but regularly. And then we actually live our life with our epitaph in mind. Now, rather than have you try and write your epitaph right now, I'm going to do a guided visualization with you that gets to the core of what our epitaph could look like. So I invite you to sit comfortably and close your eyes and put down any paper and pens that you might have, and take a few deep breaths. And I want you to imagine that you are very, very old, and you're approaching the end of your life. And I want you to imagine that you're going to go to your favorite park bench in a beautiful setting, and you've taken with you a mug that you like to drink out of. And on your way to the park bench, there's a stream. And you bend down and you dip your mug into the stream and you fill it with water. And then you continue until you get to the bench. And you sit down and you take a sip. You take a sip of this water, which is now clean to drink. All our streams are clean. Our rivers are clean, our lakes are clean, our ocean is clean. And I want you to take a deep breath and breathe in the air that is also clean. At the end of your life, we've solved many of the problems that plagued you and your friends and neighbors and people around the globe when you were younger. We no longer solve our conflicts with violence. We still have conflicts. We just don't have wars. Nobody goes to bed hungry because they have no choice, because they have no food to eat. We no longer exploit and oppress other animals. And while there are still natural extinctions, we've slowed the tide of extinctions. The world isn't perfect, but it's so much better than when you were young. And while you're sitting there on the bench, a child comes up and joins you. And this child has been studying history and learning about much darker times when we despoiled our planet and killed each other and killed other species. And this child has so many questions for you about those darker times, asking you what it was like to live through them. And then the child asks you this question: what did you do to help make the world so much better? What role did you play in helping to solve all those problems? What would you like to be able to tell the child that you did? What would you like to be able to tell the child that you did? Now open your eyes. I invite you to keep answering that question for yourself and to take home with you this idea of considering the epitaph that you would like for your life and then living it. So that's key one. What's key two? Key two is to pursue joy through service. Now, when I was thinking about this key, I actually thought of it as two separate keys: to pursue joy and to be of service. Now, the reason why I thought of pursuing joy as such a fundamental key to doing the most good and the least harm is because I was an activist, surrounded very often by other activists. Now, how many people in this room consider yourself an activist? Okay, a smattering of you, not a lot. And for those of you who consider yourself activists, how many of you ever feel anger? How many of you ever feel rage? How many of you ever feel despair? Okay. And how many of you know other activists and have worked with other activists who also feel those things? Okay, so a lot of us understand what that's like. And, you know, here's the problem with anger and rage and despair. Nobody wants to join your great activist club because you're so full of anger and rage and despair. And one of the things I kept noticing is that some of us activists just kept pushing other people away instead of drawing them close to us because we were so full of anger, rage, and despair. And nobody wanted to join our club. In fact, when I say the word activist, I often see audiences sort of cringe. How many of you, and be honest here, that your image of an activist is somebody who's filled with anger, rage, and despair? Okay, well, actually I only saw one hand, but I see a lot of people nodding. In fact, the word activist is something that a lot of people don't want to be because of that. Even though, to me, the word activist means change maker. It means somebody who is active and not passive, who's trying to make a difference. I think it's a great word, except it has a terrible, terrible connotation for lots of people. So I realized how important it was that if you were going to be trying to make a difference and be an agent of change, that you be a joyful person so that people would want to join your club. So I decided to do this very unscientific experiment, not really an experiment, more just a gathering of information, by emailing several hundred people and asking them this question: what brings you joy? I wanted to figure out, when I was writing my book, what could I suggest to help people in terms of bringing them joy? And what was really interesting is, in addition to the things that people wrote about that you would expect, like their family and children and animals and being out in nature, those things we would expect bring people joy, but so many people wrote about being of service. Over and over again, people wrote that helping others, doing good for others, brought them joy. One woman wrote this: service brings me joy. It has been the organizing principle of my adult life, informing my career decisions and my spiritual and political beliefs. On many days, it has been what gets me out of bed in the morning. It has brought extraordinary people into my life and has provided me with opportunities to see and do things I never would have imagined. Now that's clearly somebody who has had dark nights of the soul. If service has been what gets her out of bed in the morning, you know she has faced despair. You know she has faced those dark nights of the soul. But service brought her joy. Well, here's another one of the Albert Schweitzer quotes, which is this. I don't know what your destiny will be, but one thing I know. The only ones among you who will be really happy are those who will have sought and found how to serve. Now, I say this knowing that there are probably people in the audience who, like my son, have said things like, I hate community service. Anybody ever had that experience where you either felt yourself or somebody said to you, I hate community service? Okay, you know, those are one of those things people don't want to raise their hand for that. And what was really interesting is what my son would, I said, really, Forrest, you really hate community service? Because that year that you spent volunteering, going in once a week to help the first graders at the local school, you seemed to have a really good time. And he said, yeah, but that wasn't community service. I said, no, that was community service. What often we don't realize is that we think of certain things, well, community service, it's used as a punishment, right? You know, we use it as a punishment. Okay, we're not going to put you in jail. You have to do 40 hours of community service. And so we forget that actually being of service brings us joy because it's been imposed on us. It's either something we have to do in school, or we have to do it to have it on our application to get into a college, or we have to do it because we're getting punished. And often what we don't realize is all the ways that we're serving, we don't even realize they're service because we like doing them. So part of the problem is the term. However, it's really, really important that you find the right ways to serve. So I'm going to tell you a little personal story about this. My son went to an alternative independent school that was largely run by, or not necessarily run by, but it couldn't survive without all of the volunteerism of the parents. So all the parents were expected to volunteer and serve the school in many, many ways. And I would not infrequently get phone calls asking me to bake things or cook things. You know, cook 5 gallons of carrot soup or, you know, bake 2 dozen cookies for our festival or our fair. And I am the designated cook in my family already, and I don't want to do any more cooking. My husband does all the dishes, I do all the cooking. Didn't want to do any more of it. But I would feel really, really guilty when I was asked, and so I would agree to do these things. But I would do it with not a very good attitude, and sometimes I'd even show up at the festival with my 2 dozen cookies like, here are the cookies, you know, really not kind. See, David, I'm telling you. Now, the other issue, which is an aside, is that they never called my husband and asked him to bake the cookies, and that was just really bothered me. Okay, the same school was very excited to have me come teach the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders as a volunteer. And so they invited me to come do that, and I said, sure. And I would go in and I would teach the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, and I would spend so much time. In fact, I just did this last week at this school. I taught the 7th and 8th grade, and I realized that I put in about 20 hours last week. Now, how many cookies could I have made in 20 hours? I could have made so many dozens of cookies in 20 hours. Okay? And I would have had a really bad attitude about each dozen of those cookies. But I am full of joy when I am teaching those kids, even though it's a ton of time that I'm devoting to doing it. And one year, actually, this is about 5 years ago, I had shingles when I had to teach that class, or when I was scheduled to teach that class. Has anybody here had shingles? Nobody in the, yes, you have. How did it feel? It's really painful. It's really painful. Okay, shingles is adult chicken pox, or that's what they call it. And this is the way I like to describe it. It's like somebody took sandpaper and rubbed your skin raw, and then they poured rubbing alcohol on your skin. Okay, it really, really hurts. So I'd be driving to the school, and it was on my back, and I couldn't lean back, so I'm driving like this, like Richard Nixon, to get to the school. And I'm in so much pain. And then I walk into the classroom, and I start teaching, and the pain vanishes. Now, I don't mean it was masked. It was better than morphine. I am telling you, I was in zero pain. And I taught for an hour and a half, and then the class was over, and then I walked out the door, and I closed the door behind me, and it was as if somebody just poured the alcohol right back on the rubbed raw skin. Now, how is that possible? That's possible because when we are in a state of joy, when we are doing what we are meant to do, when we are doing what we love, when we are doing what is described as flow, when we are in the flow, when we are doing what we are meant to do, it's even the best analgesic in the world. So all those endorphins, doing what you love, doing what brings you joy, is so rewarding for you and for those who you help. So find the right ways to serve. Okay, the next key is to make connections and to self-reflect. Now, what do I mean by make connections? Well, earlier I was saying that we lack information about the effects of our choices, and we often lack the will to get that information. So making connections is basically exercising your will to get the information. So there's an activity I like to do with students, and I'm going to do it briefly with you, and it's called True Price, where we look at an everyday object, and instead of asking just what its true price is in terms of dollars, we ask what its true price is in terms of its cost to ourselves, to other people, to animals, and to the environment. And I brought a few objects, and we're going to choose one of them, and we're going to do this activity with it. So I brought a cheeseburger, fast food cheeseburger. I've got Fiji water bottle, and I've got a cotton t-shirt, just a regular cotton t-shirt. So we're going to choose one of these. So you have to vote. So this will be democratic. So we have cheeseburger, water bottle, and t-shirt. How many of you would like to do this with the water bottle? How many would like to do it with the t-shirt? How many would like to do it with the cheeseburger? Okay, the cheeseburger won. Oh, thank goodness. Sometimes I have to do a runoff between two of them, and it's really time-consuming. Okay, so the first question we ask in the True Price activity to make connections is this item a want or a need? Now, we know that food is a need, but is this particular item a want or a need? Is it a want or a need? Okay, does anybody think that this is a need? Is it ever a need for anybody at any time? If you're starving, okay. If you don't have any choices, okay. You know, what's really interesting is that this is a very, very, very inexpensive, in terms of dollars and cents, item that is filled with many, many calories. So if you're very, very poor, this could feel like a need because you can get lots of calories for very little money. One thing that's really fascinating to me is that in our culture, we are one of the few places where the poorest of the poor in our country are often the most obese. Now, where else in the world does that happen, that the poorest of the poor are obese? You know, most places in the world, the poorest of the poor are starving to death and are skinny and don't have enough food to eat. But here we can get tremendous amount of calories for very little money, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So for most of us, this is a want. For some people, it may at times be a need. The next question, what are the effects of this item on us as individual consumers, on other people, on animals, and on the environment? And when I say what are the effects, I mean what are the positive effects and what are the negative effects. So I'm going to ask these systematically. So let's first start with what are the positive effects of this item just on you as a consumer? So anyone? Positive effects? It's food. Okay. What else? Yes. It's cheap. Great. What else? It's convenient. Great. I can think of one more that people usually say. It's pleasurable. It's tasty. Okay. Most people like the taste of these. Okay. Great. What are some of the negative effects of this item on you as a consumer?
Poor health.
Poor health. What I heard some people at the same time. So can you repeat it?
Heart disease.
Heart disease. Yes. What else? Extra calories. What else?
Gluten sensitivity.
Gluten sensitivity for the bread. What else?
There's lots of diseases, chronic diseases that contribute, like diabetes.
Diabetes. Okay, so eaten in large quantities, okay, and we're not saying one cheeseburger causes heart disease or gaining weight or anything, but eaten in large quantities, this contributes to a host of health issues: heart disease, various cancers, stroke, type 2 diabetes, kidney disease, even impotence, many, many, many different diseases, and weight gain, and all sorts of other things. How many of you saw the movie Super Size Me? Great film, right? So there's this guy who decides to eat just a McDonald's diet, and he ends up getting so sick and gaining so much weight and having so many mood issues and so many health issues. And so he ends up, his doctor says, you have to stop this. You are really sick. And it actually takes him almost the rest of the year to lose the weight that he gained in just a month of eating this way. Okay, what about on other people? What are the positive effects on other people of this? Employment. Okay, lots and lots and lots of people get to work at fast food restaurants. So it employs a lot of people. What else?
Cheap labor.
Cheap labor. So how that helps who?
The owners.
Helps the owners. Okay. Anything else? Positives on other people?
Busy parents.
Busy parents, right? Yeah, I mean, it's so convenient. You can just stop there, and there's a playground there for your kids, and they're going to get a Happy Meal and be happy. Yeah, and lots of, and, you know, any of you have kids where the sports teams, this is where they stop after a game? So, you know, very convenient. Anything else? Yeah?
Since you said Happy Meal, I might as well throw the free toy in there.
Free toy, yeah, lots of people get free toys. Okay, what about some negative effects on other people? Yeah?
Poor work conditions.
Yeah, poor work conditions. You know, it may be a lot of people's first job, but the conditions aren't great, the pay isn't great. It's not a great career move for a lot of people. Anything else? Yes?
People that work in slaughterhouses, usually horrible conditions.
Okay, really horrible conditions for the people who work in slaughterhouses. In fact, slaughterhouse work is considered, if not the most, among the most dangerous jobs in the United States. Okay, the slaughterhouse lines are sped up so fast, and people are killing so many animals so fast and getting so many injuries, and many, many, many of those people are undocumented workers who shouldn't be in the country, who aren't in the country legally, and so they don't get any protections, they don't have health insurance, and so often they get terribly injured and they have no recourse. Anything else? Any other negative effects on other people? Yes?
Distorts farming practices and supply chain and takes farm acreage out of production for other types of, for either, in this case, for feeding animals or for certain kind of monocultures.
Great. So it takes a tremendous, this gets into the next question, which is what are the effects on the environment? But it takes a tremendous amount of grain fed to a cow to produce just a little bit of beef back. I mean, the ratio is sometimes 1 to 12. So that means that all of that land is being used and that grain is being sprayed with pesticides, and there are many, many ways that that affects all of us. And of course it's subsidized, which means that if you did want to eat animals, but you wanted to eat animals who were not treated that way or ways that were more sustainable, it would cost so much more. Somebody had their hand up back here. Did you want to say something? Okay.
I was just going to add that desensitization of the disconnect between the physically killing an animal and what you're actually doing, and also the eating of an animal.
Okay, so the desensitization that happens to people when they're killing animals or potentially eating animals, right? And it hurts local businesses. Great. Anyone else? Any other negative effects on people?
Public health, overuse of antibiotics.
Okay, right. So these are antibiotic-laden products in both the dairy and the meat. And so then antibiotics then don't work as well for us when we have diseases. And so we have to keep coming up with new antibiotics, which affects everybody. Yes?
And it creates an entire advertising industry that is based on propagation of false needs.
Yes, so there's an entire advertising industry propagating false needs. Great. Okay, we could go on and on and on and on, and we're going to do this a little bit more quickly. But I hope what you're seeing can happen is that you can look at any object. We could have done this with the water bottle. You could do it with your cell phone. You could be asking and answering these questions. It could be a dissertation for a PhD. It could be an entire course that you take here in college. I mean, there's many, many lenses that we are just scratching the surface of right now. So let's move on to the environment. Any positive effects on the environment of a fast food cheeseburger that you can think of? This one stumps the audience every time.
Well, if you don't have a car and it's right next door to you in your neighborhood, then you can just go get it.
That's true if you don't have a car, although, you know, fast food places, with the exception of in big cities, are usually car-oriented. They're drive-throughs, so they're on strip mall areas. You know, they're not your neighborhood store. But that's a good point if it is. Okay, what about some negative effects on the environment? And again, we're just going to quickly go through this so that you can use this as a template.
You practically gave us the first one, drive-through centered. So, you know, obviously we've got all the pollution going into, you know, driving around and forcing the driving concept to get into.
Right. Okay, so they're drive-through, they're highly energy intensive just to get this. In all aspects of it, right? Not just by the time it's in the store, but from where the beef comes from. I mean, there's so many different cows that wind up in here. And, you know, a lot of fast food places will say we don't use rainforest beef. But there's no way to prove that, because that beef just gets sent across the border and it's all ground up and it's all mixed in together and it's all labeled American grown. So there's even rainforest destruction involved in it. Anything else? Yes? Yeah, so cows produce methane, so lots and lots of greenhouse gases, not just the methane, but also all of the pieces, all the fossil fuels that go into this, from the fertilizer sprayed on the grains and the grains that are transported to the cows, and then the cows that are transported to the slaughterhouses, and then the refrigerated trucks that take them to the different McDonald's. I mean, it's an endless process. In fact, the UN has declared animal agriculture to be a bigger contributor to global warming than transportation. Okay? Animal agriculture. Shocking. Okay, I'm going to move on really fast simply because there's a lot to get through. And the purpose of this activity with you is to help you start to see that you could be making connections and asking these questions about everything. And so not to dwell and focus solely on the cheeseburger. Okay, but let's talk quickly about the animals. Are there any positives for animals of this item that you can think of? Somebody, last time I asked this question, said, well, it's good for chickens. And you know what? That's actually really, really true. because many, many people don't eat red meat, and they're replacing red meat with chicken. In fact, on Weekend Edition on NPR this past weekend, they were reporting that 1 billion chicken wings were eaten this past weekend for Super Bowl weekend. That translates into 500 million chickens who were killed for a weekend. And all of them were raised in the most extreme cruelty. It would be absolutely illegal to do what we do to chickens, to our pet birds. And so it was interesting when somebody said, well, it's good for chickens. I think they were saying it sort of tongue-in-cheek, but it really is true, because if you do eat meat and you eat a portion of a cow, you're eating a tiny portion of a large animal. Whereas if you eat chickens, you're eating these very small animals and causing many, many more to suffer. So it was an interesting point. But what are some of the other negative effects on animals that you can think of this food choice? Yes?
Death, poor conditions.
Death, poor conditions. Yes. Yes, in the back.
The monoculture of the fields and the feedlots displaces native animals.
Right. So much wildlife has been displaced because we're using all of this land to grow crops to feed to animals. Anything else? Yes. Well, we're talking about animals now. Yeah, but water usage too. A tremendous amount of water is wasted to produce meat as compared to producing grain or vegetables or legumes. Yes?
Well, the runoff from farms pollute streams, which end up in the Gulf of Mexico and cause the fish kill, so they're killing off
Right.
large areas.
Right. Yeah, so we have sewage systems for ourselves. We have no sewage systems for cows and pigs and chickens, and so their waste just winds up polluting. What about this item? What are the effects on animals of this?
The veal cows, veal.
Okay, how is this cheese related to veal? Okay, yeah, so veal calves are the male offspring, generally, of dairy cows. And why is that? Well, dairy cows have to produce a baby every year. They are impregnated and have to produce a baby every year in order to produce milk, right? They don't just spontaneously produce milk. They're mammals like we are. They only produce milk to feed their own babies. So what we do is we make them have a baby every year, and then we take that baby away on the first day of life. So these mothers will bellow out for days when their babies are essentially kidnapped from them when they're born. And if they're female, they're going to be raised to be dairy cows like their moms. But if they're male, they're of no use to the dairy industry, but they're from breeds that are different than the ones that are used by the beef industry. So they're usually sold off for veal. And many of you, how many of you are aware of this sort of specialty milk-fed veal with calves chained at the neck in tiny stalls? How many of you have heard about that? Okay, a lot of people are raising their hand. Because this became big in the news, that veal calves would be chained at the neck in tiny stalls, unable to take more than a step forward, a step back, fed a diet deficient in iron to keep their flesh pale, completely deprived of exercise for the duration of their life to keep their flesh tender, and then forced when they're 4 months old to walk on their atrophied legs with an electric prod onto a truck. And so what does that have to do with the dairy industry is that it's just a byproduct of the dairy industry. So thank you for bringing that up. And of course, then what happens to their mothers? Their mothers are forced to produce all this milk. And normally a mother would produce about 7 pounds of milk a day for her baby, but we're forcing cows to produce about 70 pounds, 10 times the amount. And so what happens to them? What happens to them is they end up having mastitis and other painful other diseases, and then they're fed antibiotics. So it's a terrible system. Okay, I think you've heard enough about the burger. And so we're going to move on by asking 2 more questions in True Price. The next question is, what are the systems that perpetuate this item? So what are the systems that perpetuate this item? Okay, advertising, marketing industry, right, what else? Yeah. The government through subsidies. One time I asked that question and somebody in the audience said capitalism, which actually in the case of a cheeseburger is not quite right, because if this were a product of free market capitalism, it would be really, really expensive. But we subsidize this industry through our tax dollars, and so it becomes really, really cheap to buy it in the store, but we're all paying those costs as taxpayers by subsidizing the water and the land and all different parts of this process. And then, of course, we end up subsidizing the health problems that arise from it. So this is a very expensive item that's very cheap in the store, not because of capitalism, but because it's basically a socialized food item. Okay, last question. What would do more good and less harm? What would be a Mogo alternative to this cheeseburger? A veggie burger? What? Cooking something yourself. Okay. What?
Loving Hut is this fast food, like Chinese place. It's like a lot in Great Britain, but there's some.
Okay, so fast food that is different in some way?
It's a vegan fast food place.
Okay, a vegan fast food. Okay, so there are lots of options. There's no one alternative to this. A lot of people, when I ask this, will say grass-fed beef or beef from your neighbor. There are lots of alternatives that would do more good and less harm. And the question is important because once we start looking at everyday items and we start making connections, then we start to ask ourselves, okay, how could I be doing more good and less harm? And when you ask yourself that question, a whole panoply of opportunities opens up for you to more deeply align your choices with your values. Because most of us don't value cruelty to animals and environmental destruction and the exploitation of people. Most of us don't value those things. So how could we make different choices that are more aligned with our values? Well, with the case of a cheeseburger, we actually have some great alternatives. We can make very different choices that still taste good, are more nutritious, and are also inexpensive, and we're happy and we're more aligned with our values. It does become harder when we want to replace our cell phone with a Mogo alternative. That becomes harder, which brings me to the next key. So the next key is to model your message and work for change. Now that sounds like two keys, right? That sounds sort of like the pursue joy through service. It doesn't sound like it's just one key. But to me, it's two sides of the same coin. So what do I mean by model your message? Well, Mahatma Gandhi was once asked by a reporter, what is your message? Now, Gandhi had this really big message. He was trying to free his country from British rule using only nonviolent methods, something that maybe had never been done before. But on that particular day, even though he could have talked on and on and on and was used to talking to people, large groups of people, and delivering his message, on that particular day, he responded to the reporter by simply saying, "My life is my message." That's all he said. My life is my message. Now, when I read that, it really brought me up short because I realized that if Gandhi's life was his message, then my life was my message. That in fact, each of our lives is our message, whether we like it or not. Each one of our lives is our message, whether we like it or not. And so the question then becomes, are you living your life in such a way that you're modeling the message that you most want to model? Now, Albert Schweitzer said something similar. He said, my life is my argument. My life is my argument. And I think he meant the same thing. So modeling your message is basically walking your talk. It's living with integrity. But unfortunately, in today's world, it's not enough. Now, why is it not enough? It's not enough because of all those systems that are still unjust and unsustainable and inhumane that we can't just model our message out of. We can't just choose a different cell phone or a different computer. And many of us need cars. And we can't just make a different choice. We could get a Prius instead of a Hummer, but we're still causing a lot of problems. a lot of environmental destruction. And so here's where the next step that is so important comes in, and that is to work for change. Now, what do I mean by work for change? I mean try to change a system, and you don't need to do it by being an activist. If that's not your style, you can do it by being an inventor. You can do it within whatever professions you pursue. There's so many young people in this room who are going to go into so many different professions. Whatever profession that you go into, you can ensure that the systems in that profession are humane and sustainable and just, and shift them and change them through your good work. So who are some change makers, and what have they done? Well, in a month, you're going to get to hear from Muhammad Yunus. How many of you have heard of Muhammad Yunus? Okay, I'm seeing a few hands go up. Muhammad Yunus was an economics professor in Bangladesh, and he was an economics professor during his country's great famine. And people were dying all around him for lack of food while he was teaching economics and wondering, what is all my knowledge of economics good for if I can't even help the people who are living and dying all around me for lack of food to eat? And so he went and he talked to the villagers. He gathered 41 people together and he asked them what they needed. And the shock of his life is when they said they needed $27 combined for all 41 of them in order to just bring food to market, to bring rice to market, to sell it. So he loaned them the money. And that launched, this was in the 1970s, that launched the Microcredit Movement. He then started Grameen Bank. Grameen Bank was just a bank, right? But it did this radically different thing. It loaned small amounts of money to poor people who had no collateral, nothing of value to ensure that they could pay it back, which was the opposite of how banking is normally done. Most of the time, if you want to borrow money, you got to have something to prove that you can pay it back. And if you don't have the something, you can't borrow the money. So the more you have, the more money you can borrow, and the less you have, the less money you can borrow. And these people were dirt poor. And he said you can borrow money, and he had repayment plans, and he had a 98% repayment, 98% from the poorest people in his community. And this spread around the world, and now all of us can actually participate. You can just go to kiva.org, Kiva, K-I-V-A.org, and you could loan $25 to help somebody start a business. They may need $300 total, but because this is online with enough people, they get that $300 in a week and they pay it back over 6 months, and you've just lifted somebody out of poverty by loaning some money. Because this one guy who was an economics professor had this great idea. He became a change maker. He changed a system. And amazingly, he won the Nobel Prize, which is not amazing. That made perfect sense. But amazingly, he won the Nobel Prize not for economics. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. Why? Because lifting people out of poverty brings peace. So there was a change maker. Another change maker, Henry Spira. Any of you heard of Henry Spira? Okay, a few hands going up. Henry Spira was a union organizer. He was a really gruff man. He lived in New York City. And Henry was really upset about the exploitation of animals. And he found out about product testing on animals, in which things like soap and oven cleaner and personal care products, shampoo, cosmetics were being dripped into the eyes of conscious rabbits, force-fed to animals in quantities that kill, smeared onto their abraded skin, and then killed. And he thought that this was a terrible thing. So what he did is he raised a lot of money to take an ad out in the New York Times. And the ad, it was a full-page ad, and it had a picture of a rabbit with the eyes blacked out and the words, "How many rabbits does Revlon blind for beauty's sake?" Well, that launched a movement against product testing on animals. And now everybody in this room, if you don't want to buy personal care and cleaning products tested on animals, you don't have to. You don't have to look very far to find the Leaping Bunny logo or something that says not tested on animals or cruelty-free. One person had an idea, he tried to change a system, and together we did. So the system that I'm trying to change is the educational system. So that's what I spend most of my days working to transform. Now, what's wrong with the educational system? Well, these days, when you ask what's wrong with the educational system, you hear about how our kids are graduating and they're not verbally, mathematically, or scientifically literate. Our test scores are low. They're really low compared to other industrialized nations. And we can't compete in the global economy. If you go to the United States Department of Education's website and you look at the mission statement, in the mission statement, it says that we need to prepare our students to compete in the global economy. To me, that goal of competing in the global economy is completely myopic for today's world. Given the problems we face, the ones that I mentioned at the beginning, global warming, 7 billion people, 1 billion of whom don't have access to clean water, all those problems, I think we need a bigger goal than competing in the global economy. In fact, if we just do a thought experiment and we imagine that every student in the United States actually graduates from high school having passed all of their standardized tests with flying colors, and then every single one of them finds a job, chances are that we're simply going to contribute to the perpetuation and escalation of all those problems. Because what those students weren't getting was the tools and the motivation and the knowledge to be what I like to call solutionaries for a better world. They weren't understanding and making the connections between their choices and their effects. So we need more than competing in the global economy. I think we need to have a goal of graduating a generation of solutionaries. So that is the system that I'm working to change. So what system do you want to change? What issues do you care about, and what system do you want to change? Think about that question and let that question guide you in your life's work and in your future life's work if you're a college student here. So I'm going to move on to the fifth key, which is to find and create community, because it can be really, really difficult to do this work alone. How many of you have ever felt that you're the only person you know who cares about an issue and is working to solve it? Has that happened to anybody here? Okay, a few people. It is lonely. It is hard. We need support. We need community. We need other people to work with us. This was really driven home to me about a week ago. My husband and I were going ice skating. And there's this place that we've always wanted to ice skate near our home in Maine. I live about 3.5 hours up the coast of Maine. So we went to this wilderness area. There was a stream that led out to a bog, about a half a mile from a bog, and we'd always wanted to go to this bog and skate there. So we skated the couple of miles to get to the end of the stream and then hike out to the bog. And the stream was beautiful. The stream was black ice. It was perfect skating. It was just lovely. Well, it was perfect except for when my foot fell in a couple times, but that's okay. I didn't completely fall in. So we get out to the bog, and the ice on the bog is terrible because that pond had frozen, and then we'd had a big snow, and it was just terrible, terrible ice. Really hard to skate on. But we really wanted to try, and we figured we couldn't see the whole bog because it was several miles long, so we'd just try. So we're going over this terrible, bumpy, crunchy, awful ice, and it was about 15 degrees, and the wind was in our face, and it was about 20 miles an hour. It was miserable. And we decided we would just head to that pine tree and just see how the ice was. So we get to the pine tree, and we see that the ice is a little bit better. There are patches of smooth ice, but mostly it's just really crummy ice. But we decide we're going to just persevere a little bit. But the wind's really intense. It's really miserable. And after just 10 minutes or so, I said, you know what? I don't think this is worth it. Let's go back. And my husband says to me, you know, we're probably never going to be here again. Let's just keep going. So we keep going. About 10 minutes later, my husband turns to me and said, you're right. This is terrible. Let's go back. And I skate by him and I say, we're never going to be here again. Let's keep going. So we keep going. And about 10 minutes later, I've really had it, and the ice is really, really bad. And I say, okay, I'm done. And he says, we're not there yet. So he keeps going, and I follow him, and you know, you can see what's coming. 10 minutes later, he says, okay, I agree. And I say, we're not there yet. And I keep going. And then we finally get to about a half a mile from the end. And the ice is, there is no smooth ice anywhere. It is all bumpy. It is all crunchy. It is all awful. And I am 100% sure that he is going to agree with me that at this point, we're going to turn back. Why would we stay? We can see the end. And so I said, right, let's just go back. And he said, but we're not at the end. And so we skated till the end. And at least on the way back, we had the wind at our back. But what this taught me was how important it is to have a partner, at least one person, who's going to support our ambitious goals. If I hadn't had him and if he hadn't had me, we never would have made it. Not that that necessarily would have been a bad thing, but if we'd actually had a better goal, a goal that was really worth having, then how important is it to have somebody to support you? So make sure you find and create that community for yourself. Which brings me to the most exciting of the 7 keys. Are you ready for it? Yes. Okay. Okay, here it is. Take responsibility. Okay, now you're all looking at me like, really? That was the most exciting thing you could offer me? Because taking responsibility sounds like a big old drag. In fact, when I hear the term taking responsibility, I think of my parents. And it doesn't sound good at all. For how many of you is that true? Yeah, a lot of people do not like being told to take responsibility. So let me reframe this whole concept of responsibility for you. How many of you have heard of the Milgram Experiments? Okay, good. A lot of you have heard of it. Well, I'm going to tell the story of the Milgram Experiments for those who haven't, and for those who have, I think you'll see where this is going. So Stanley Milgram in the 1960s was a psychology professor at Yale University, and he devised an experiment. And he put an ad in the paper looking for people who would be willing to participate for $4 an hour, which, I don't know, maybe that would be $12 an hour now. I'm not sure exactly, but it wasn't that they were volunteers. They were being paid to participate. And what they were being told that they were participating in is the effects of punishment on learning. It was a memory test. But that really wasn't what the experiment was testing at all. So what the experiment did, what he did, is he brought 2 people together and he had them draw straws to choose roles. One was going to be the learner and one was going to be the teacher. Now, in reality, it was rigged. And there was an actor who was going to be the learner every time. But the other person didn't know that. They were really the one who was the subject of the test. And so they were going to be in the role of the teacher. And so the teacher was brought in with the learner and into where the learner was going to be seated, which was at a chair and then hooked up to electrodes. And the teacher got to see all this, and then the teacher was placed into a separate room and could no longer see the learner, but could hear the learner. And the teacher was placed in front of a console. And the console had voltage levers on it from 15 volts to 450 volts in 15-volt increments. And the last couple of levers, the last 3 levers were in red. It said danger, XXX, severe shock. Now, before they went into their separate rooms, the learner, who remember is just an actor, okay, is just in a role, he's not going to get shocked at all, he's going to pretend to be shocked, mentions that he has a heart condition. Okay, the teacher is placed in front of the console and told to ask questions to the learner, and if the learner gets the question wrong, the teacher is supposed to administer a shock, starting with 15 volts. Another question wrong, 30 volts, another 45, and so on all the way up. Now, the psychology graduate students at Yale were asked to predict what percentage of people would go all the way up to the end, 450 volts. Now, this is what was going to happen if they continued. So right from the get-go, the learner would cry out, you know, ow, that hurts, and sometimes complain about their heart condition. I mean, there was actually a script. So it was the same at certain voltages. They would say or cry out, beg for it to stop, say, I want to get out of here. And at some point, if it got all the way up to the end, the learner stopped vocalizing at all. Now, what would you think if you were the teacher at that point? He's dead or he's unconscious, right? I mean, you know, he's been crying out, saying, please stop, this has to stop, and then suddenly stops. Now, obviously, the teachers are getting upset about this. I mean, most people, unless they're sociopaths or psychopaths, they don't want to hurt somebody. They just met this poor guy. But every time they would complain or say they didn't want to stop or say to the Stanley Milgram, who was standing there with his white lab coat, you know, is this okay? I don't feel good about this. Stanley Milgram had a script too, and he would say, please continue. And if it went further, he'd say, and the person complained, he'd say, the experiment requires that you continue. And if it went all the way to the fourth time that they've complained and said they just don't want to do this anymore, Stanley Milgram would say, we assume all responsibility. Okay, so when the psychology grad students at Yale were asked to predict what percentage of people would go all the way up to the end, given everything I've just told you, they predicted that about 1.5% to 2% would go all the way up to the end, thinking that they were harming, possibly killing this person they just met. Now that's a reasonable prediction because 1.5% to 2% of the population are psychopaths. So why not predict that that would be 1.5% to 2%? Well, the results of this were what was really shocking. 2/3 went all the way up to the end. 2/3. 100% of them went up to 350 volts. And 2/3 went to the end. So look around the room. 2/3 of us would have done it too. We are not different. And this experiment was actually, first it was just done with men, then it was done with women to see if women would be different. Women were not different. This is who we are. We are willing to do that when an authority tells us to. So what does that have to do with taking responsibility? Well, after these studies were done, after these experiments were over, the people who participated in them over the period of time that it was done were asked whether they were glad that they had. And 92% were either very glad or glad that they had participated, even though they had to learn something pretty terrible about themselves, right? Well, one of them said this. While I was a subject in 1964, even though I believed that I was hurting someone, I was totally unaware of why I was doing so. Few people ever realize when they are acting according to their own beliefs and when they are meekly submitting to authority. To permit myself to be drafted, because this was right during the Vietnam War, to permit myself to be drafted with the understanding that I am submitting to authority's demand to do something very wrong would make me frightened of myself. I am fully prepared to go to jail if I am not granted conscientious objector status. Indeed, it is the only course I could take to be faithful to what I believe. That man gained his freedom by taking responsibility. His freedom to even go to jail rather than do something that violated his beliefs. When we take responsibility for our choices, for our actions, for how we participate in our democracy, for the things we buy and wear and eat and do, when we take responsibility for our world, we take back our freedom from doing what advertisers tell us to do, our freedom from doing what authority figures tell us to do, our freedom from keeping up with the Joneses. That is why taking responsibility is the most exciting key. The last key is to strive for balance. And here's where I always expect audiences to just sort of break out into laughter, because I've just asked you to do all this stuff, to live your epitaph, and to pursue joy through service, and to make connections, and self-reflect, and model your message, and work for change, and take responsibility. And now I'm saying, and strive for balance. So we have to find the ways to strive for balance, because we could make ourselves crazy. Because we live in an imperfect world, and hopefully we will each try to perfect it in our way. And in order to strive for balance, I will leave you with this quote of Schweitzer's, the last quote of Schweitzer's that I'll share with you. Success is not the key to happiness. Happiness is the key to success. If you love what you are doing, you will be successful. And so I have 3 questions for you. What issues do you care most about? What issues do you care most about? What are you good at? What are you good at? And what do you love to do? What do you love to do? As you explore the answers to those questions and you find the place where those answers meet, you will find your life's work. And there's nothing better. So, I leave you with this one idea, that what you do matters. It matters to you, it matters to your family and friends and all of the people you will interact with, and it also matters to all of the other beings on this planet with whom our lives are inextricably linked. One day you will die, and wouldn't it be nice to know that you did what you could to live your epitaph, and that you can die without regrets because you did so. So that's what I wanted to share with you, and I want to tell you just a little bit about the organization that I work for in case we can help you. And I want to let you know about somebody else in the audience who lives here in Connecticut and can also help. So I am, as David mentioned, the co-founder of the Institute for Humane Education. And we prepare people to be humane educators who can teach about these interconnected issues. And so if this interests you, we would like to help. If you think that you might want to be a teacher one day, we would like to help. We have 100 free downloadable resources on our website to teach about these interconnected issues. We have online courses, we have workshops, we even have a graduate program, the distance learning graduate program that's in humane education. We have an MEd degree and an MA degree. And we also do workshops that are called Mogo workshops that basically do what I do in this past hour, but in a whole day. And Neil Hornish, if you just wave and stand up, Neil is, yay! Neil is a graduate of our MEd degree. He's also on our board of directors, and he lives in Connecticut, and he leads Mogo workshops. And he has a sign-up sheet at the table out there. I have a sign-up sheet, too, for the Institute and some of our literature. So if you're interested in exploring these ideas more and doing a whole workshop around it, please talk to Neil or sign his mailing list. So you're all educators. Everybody in this room is an educator. You may not think you are, but you are. We teach all the time. So I invite you to go out and to help teach everybody you meet how we can make a better world, and do so by starting with yourself and modeling your message. Or, as Schweitzer would say, living your argument. So any questions or comments or thoughts before we wrap up for tonight? Yes?
Somewhat political related, if you were in a room with the vice president of the NRA, I forget, Wayne LaPierre, and you were responding to his view that every teacher should be armed, what would you say?
You know, I'd want to have a long conversation with him about how he thinks that that's the effective way to solve the problem. I mean, you know, just practically, it seems really impractical to me. Even if it worked, right? Even if it worked, it seems impractical, it seems really costly, it seems potentially dangerous, and it doesn't seem like it would actually stop other people. So I would want to just have that conversation and not have an argument, but actually have a conversation. I don't know how far I'd get, though. Yes?
Great talk. I really enjoyed your positive imagery exercise. It was fantastic.
Thanks.
I wonder about, I'm in ag and forestry, and I'm wondering about a lot of the topic asked almost how do we encounter our choices on food, and where so much of our agricultural system has been modified to sustain the world's population. So how do we wind back the clock without winding back the clock?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a big fan of winding back the clock, because I don't think that, you know, previous times were necessarily all that great. I think we tend to romanticize them. And besides, I'm a big Star Trek fan, so I want to wind the clock forward. So I don't think I don't know how we go about feeding the world, particularly as our population continues to grow. I don't know how we do it in the most sustainable ways. I know a lot of it is political, that there's actually enough food to feed everybody in the world. It's getting it to them. But I also know that we waste so much food that, you know, if we just reduced meat consumption by 10%, that the grain that is freed up by that could feed the 60 million people who starve to death every year. And so these are very complex questions about how we can solve these problems. But I don't, you know, some people are very focused on local agriculture as the key to solving these issues, and also on small-scale agriculture as the key to solving these issues. And I'm not convinced that that is the key to solving the issues everywhere. I think that these are really complicated issues, and there's this wonderful book that's called How Bad Are Bananas? It's by a guy named Berners-Lee, and that's hyphenated, Berners-Lee. I forget his first name. And he does a true price analysis, or really an ecological footprint analysis of all of these different products, food products, other products. And what was really interesting is the hothouse tomatoes grown 10 miles from him in the winter had a larger ecological footprint than the bananas that were being shipped from the equator, just because there was so much energy intensity that went into those hothouse tomatoes. So these are very complex issues. And the key, if you're going into forestry and ag, I just invite you to think in very complex ways about people, animals, and the environment, and the whole big package. Because I think what we tend to do is we tend to glom on to some movement, whether it's the locavore movement or it's any other movement, as the panacea. And generally, we don't have a good panacea for a complex, globalized world. And, you know, I might be, I'm certainly not unique, but I might be in the minority here. But every time when I was younger and I would hear about a terrible natural disaster or atrocity or war or something that happened somewhere, and the news would report the number of Americans who were killed, I always found myself stunned by that, as if Americans counted more than other people. I couldn't relate. You know, it would be like somebody doing a report about how many people from Maine were killed as opposed to the United States. I couldn't narrow my compassion and my concern. And so I think that we need to think in these complex ways, because, you know, somebody who says, I'm only going to buy local, you know, there could be a women's collective in Guatemala that is surviving because people in the United States are willing to buy their fair trade products. And yes, those fair trade products are being shipped. So I want to change the energy system so that we have truly sustainable, renewable energy, rather than say, no, I'm going to just narrow and just have this local movement. And I know you weren't just talking about that, but I just went off on that tangent. So I probably didn't even answer your question, but I tried. Anyone else? Yes?
Capitalism came up.
Yeah.
But I'd like to shift a little bit to maybe something that Matt Taibbi at the Rolling Stone spoke about, several essays. Too big to fail, too big to fail. And so there's a class that is actually worldwide, that is above regulation, above the law, and is perpetuating a system that seems inimical to much of what you're talking about.
Yep.
And yet, they're change makers. They did inventive things like, say, with the LIBOR rate. They are a number of steps ahead in inventive new algorithmic processes that seem to be completely counter to what many here perhaps value.
Yep.
How do you address that?
You know, I'm so glad you brought that up, because rarely are these, you know, things black and white. We tend to think in black and white terms. in our society. In fact, it's one of my pet peeves. And this, I'm going to wrap up here because I know a lot of people are needing to leave. And so this will be the last question that I answer. One of my pet peeves is our insistence on putting everything into either-or terms instead of thinking about solutions. And I think that you raised something that's really important. And one of the fundamental systems that I think that we need to change, and it's so unsexy, but it's campaign finance reform. That I think that until we change the system by which corporations actually own government by having funded government, then we're not going to be able to, that we're going to have those problems, that people will just be beholden to these corporations, and so we have this corporatocracy, so that we have to sort of accept the good with the bad. And there's plenty of these, just what you're saying, plenty of innovative ideas, but we still need to we need as citizens to be able to judge these corporations and be able to have regulations that protect us, and so that we can have innovation and we can also have safeguards. And there's a wonderful book called Capitalism 3.0 by Peter Barnes, who was one of the founders of Working Assets. And it's a great book. I highly recommend it. And there's many of these other books that are really looking like, how can we have a capitalist system that is really not destructive in the ways that our system has become destructive, but respects also all the innovations that come out of the system. So I think that's a great question. I'm not sure I answered that one either. But thank you all so much for coming out. Please come to our table and sign up and talk to Neil and to me. And I wish you all very well. Thank you.